On today's episode, I talk to Richard Reeves, a leading scholar, author, and thought leader on modern masculinity, gender equality, and the evolving roles of men in society. As a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and author of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It, Richard has been at the forefront of the conversation on how shifting societal expectations are reshaping masculinity, identity, and success. His work examines the systemic challenges men face in education, mental health, and professional life, while offering practical solutions for a more balanced and inclusive future. He offers a nuanced, science-backed, and compassionate discussion on what it means to be a man today and how we can reimagine masculinity for the future. I first saw Richard or heard Richard on Diary of a CEO, and I was really drawn in, being the mother of two boys, by this researcher that was talking all about how one of the leading killers of young men is suicide and the underlying issues that are causing that. It's fascinating to talk to him from this perspective of, he studies equality. So, he talks about being a feminist, like he is all for feminism. That's something that he's worked for, and it was almost accidental that he came into all this research around men and how all this beautiful attention coming to us as women and building the equality for women. He's also discovering that in that journey that our young men are becoming lost. They feel like their identity of the protector and the provider is falling by the wayside. So they've lost their North Star. And the masculine, we know that the primary intrinsic thing that a man needs to feel fulfilled is purpose. And this identity piece of them being the protector and the provider has been taken from them, or at least that's how it perceives in our society. Now, he also talks a lot about toxic masculinity and how a lot of young men have just ingested that masculinity equals toxicity. Now, although we know there's a lot of toxic masculinity out there, I found myself researching what incels were, and I'm like, yeah, dude, that is not a good thing. There are really unresourceful expressions of masculinity. Yes, we know that. However, what I really focus on with Richard in this interview is how we can best support our boys and how we can best create equality across both genders, meaning that the equality of fulfillment, of heart, of love, of feeling safe in their identity. Because I get that as women, we have not had that for so many years, like for generation after generation after generation after generation. However, just because we haven't had it, it doesn't mean we need to take it from somebody else. So as a mother of boys, I find Richard and his discussion and his book of Boys and Men, which I read, so incredibly empowering, because I would never, ever want my boys to feel the way so many men are feeling right now. So I'm going to leave you. Enjoy the interview with Richard Reeves. Hey, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. Now, I am super excited to talk to my guest today because I actually heard him on, I believe it was Diary of a CEO a long time ago, and I'm literally listening to this episode going, God, I wish I could ask you some very specific questions. So, Richard Reeves, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. No, that's a bit scary because that suggests that you've got harder questions to answer than Stephen maybe asked. But let's see. I hope so.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say harder. I'm a mum of two boys, and my whole, my work, my business, everything, it's really on about really empowering people into their own sovereignty, to really understand that it is on us to create our reality. And I think that this is a topic that, honestly, it was the statistics around men's mental health and the death rate that really sparked my interest initially. I was like, Jesus, I really need to talk to this guy because I have some theories and I'd love to hear what he thinks about it. But before we get into that, I'd really love to hear about how you even came about doing this work. I mean, was it a challenge that you came upon yourself, or this was just an area of interest? So I'd love to hear the journey from perhaps the what I call the dark night of the soul, that the challenge, the invitation into the journey, to, you know, what you've done today in, you know, yes, you've authored a number of books. Is that correct?
A few, yeah.
Yeah. And Of Boys and Men is one that I've been reading, and I just love it. It actually, honestly, depresses the hell out of me, but I also love that there's a lot of potential in there as well. So I'd love to hear your journey from there to today before we really dive into the topic.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again for having me on and for your work. I mean, I've been interested in the issues of gender and parenting and, you know, ever since. I mean, I consider myself pretty card-carrying feminist for a long time. I thought that re-establishing different gender roles was massively important. It's a big part of my identity. And then I had 3 sons, raised them, went through my own sort of process, I think, of trying to figure out how to be authentically myself, including as a guy, whilst also being a strong partner to my wife and supporter of gender equality. And I think in some ways that sort of personified what I think is happening culturally. I think we are still struggling how to do that. How do we have equality without androgyny? Because I don't really think we want androgyny. No one does really, right? I think women overall quite like being women, and vice versa for men. But women quite rightly have said, yeah, well, I also want to be able to be CEO or president or prime minister if I want to. Thank you. Quite right. And then I was doing this work at Brookings, the Brookings Institution, on equality in terms of economics, education, race, family life. And I just kept hitting these data points, I think some of which have struck you. I was like, wow, a lot of guys are not doing very well. And not enough people are talking about it in the right way. And so it just felt to me that this was a really badly neglected issue. And so I decided to go for it. And it was difficult. Actually, I couldn't get a publisher to start with. It was a particular moment politically in the US, but nonetheless, it was seen as quite a sensitive topic. And a lot of my friends and colleagues said, you'll just be written off as a reactionary, right? The only people who talk about boys and men are people who are anti-women and girls. And so you can't avoid that. And I just thought that was an invitation to do better. And that's what I've tried to do.
I love that. And I'm so fascinated by this whole, you know, even finding it difficult to get a publisher, because how dare we talk about boys and men? And I think that's something for me personally, I kind of stay away from labels. You know, like, I am a female CEO, I own my own business, I'm, you know, all for women's rights. And I'm also the mother of 2 young men. And I find that really almost irresponsible that we are so quick to point the finger at these kids. They're kids. They don't even know who they are yet, and say, oh, yeah, you're not important. And it just, honestly, it makes me furious.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem, isn't it? Is that we've made too many boys and young men, and maybe men generally, feel like we've not noticed that they're struggling, that we're not seeing their challenges. And that's created a huge vacuum in our politics and our culture.
So at the risk of, you know, oversimplifying, can you just give us a bit of a snapshot at, like, what is going on with men right now? Because I know in Australia we've had, and even when I was like, I'm Gen X, so even when I was younger, there was an issue with men and suicide. But now I feel like it's almost like a really massive global issue. So I'd love you just to take a bit of a snapshot of what is going on with boys and men right now.
Yeah, I will. And also, I have to give a shout out here to the work of people like Movember, and in particular, people like Zach Seidler, who runs their research in Australia, who are global leaders on this issue, really. And I think what's happened around the suicide issue is, first of all, we've recognized that A, it's just so much higher risk for men than for women. B, in some places it's risen, and C seems to be particularly affecting young men. So I can speak to the US statistics more confidently, but in the US it's 4 times higher for men than for women. Those ratios are similar elsewhere, including Australia. It's 40,000 men a year in the US, And it's really risen among young men recently. And in the UK, it's the biggest killer of men under the age of 50. And so these are losses of life at very huge scale. So in the US, we lose about as many men every year to suicide as we lose women to breast cancer. And they're very different kinds of issues. But I do think that as a public health problem, we're not taking the loss of life from male suicide seriously enough as a gendered health issue in the way that we would if it was the other way around. And so I've really come to believe that that's just an example of a broader set of challenges that men are facing. We also know, thanks to work that one of Zach Siegler's colleagues has just produced, that Michael Wilson, that family breakdown, family separation is a huge risk factor for suicide rates among men. You see it especially among young men, where it's just like the suicide rate among separated young men is like 9 times higher than among married young men. That's that order of magnitude. And so what that tells us, I think, is that actually male mental health is very strongly associated with family life, with structure, with purpose, and candidly with feeling needed. And it was actually an Australian researcher, Fiona Shand, who put me on to the finding that men who take their own lives are most likely to describe themselves in one of the following 2 ways, either as being useless or worthless. And that, I think, is the dark heart of this matter. And we have to just confront that as a real issue.
Yeah, and that, like, as I say, as a mum of two boys, like 18 and just about to turn 14, like, that's awful, for them to think that they even would consider that they're useless just is heartbreaking. So I'm kind of curious from this perspective of, do you think this crisis is kind of stemming from a deep confusion? Because, boys and men have been told who to be for the longest time. And, like, you are the provider, you are the protector, this is your role. And now it's this, that freaking word that I got to admit, I see the value of it, but I don't love it. I don't love labels. Like, I'm not a person that loves labels. I don't like this whole concept that we're separate, that we're all different. Like, no, actually, we're all freaking human beings on planet Earth. So if we could come back to that. But for me, I feel like there is this problem that men have been told who to be forever. And now they're being told, well, don't be a toxic male. And they're like, well, then who the am I,
Right. Yeah. I like the way you talk about that. I agree. I think that the challenge has been the old script, the old model of manhood, if you like. It's really just been taken away for mostly good reasons, right? Actually, as women have become more economically independent, then the idea that men have some sort of monopoly on breadwinning, being the provider, has gone away. And that's the point. As Gloria Steinem, the women's rights leader in the US, said, she said the whole point of this movement is to make marriage a choice for women rather than a necessity. And I think that has been very largely achieved, and I think that is good. But good things very often come with a but. That does then raise a question, well, what is the role of men? And I think we're doing, as you suggest, a much better job of telling men what not to be, how not to behave, what we don't want them to be. So we have an entirely negative script now for men. Don't be toxic, don't mansplain, don't manspread, etc. And so you end up with, and my own sons are a bit older than yours now, but in their 20s. But I was really struck by their own curriculums, is that they were basically just a long list of don'ts and no do's. And I think if you have a script for what it means to be, say, a man in today's world that is entirely defined negatively, it's entirely about don'ts rather than do's, then we shouldn't be surprised if so many men are struggling to figure out their place in the world.
Yeah, and I like, honestly, I've done a lot of work around like the feminine and the masculine, and the number one thing around masculine energy is purpose. And I feel like they have had this, men have had this, indoctrinated. And I mean, women like me, I will admit, I've used the word, the patriarchy in, so many times. But what's happened to everyday man, because really the patriarchy is this small percentage of, and it's the same with anything, right? It's this small percentage of men who have tried to control the masses. So then the masses get painted with the same brush. And I feel like the biggest thing, and this was the thing that just hit me when I was listening to you talking to Stephen, I'm like, I really feel like it's purpose. Like, our boys have to learn that their number one priority is, especially in today's world, is purpose. Like, what is your purpose? It might be your family and providing and all of those things, but it might not be. And I think that this is one of the things I know it's really huge with my kids. My eldest, who's 18, he was with his girlfriend for a long time. They just broke up. And, she was ready to basically settle down. And I remember saying to him, dude, you're not even going to know who you are until you're 30. So if whoever you want to be for someone else, you have to first work out who you're going to be for you. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts on that, because I think that so much of this for boys and men, it comes back to purpose, and they're not being taught that your purpose is not freaking school. It's not university. It's not your vocation. It might be, but there's something bigger in men that really need to go out and forge their purpose in the world.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's controversial to say this maybe, but I think that's more true of men than of women. And the reason I think that is at some quite deep level, women know that they're going to have a purpose, which is reproductive. But only 50% of men have reproduced historically. And so actually you have to provide men, or men have to find more of a sense of purpose. I think it does come a bit more naturally to women. Now, the danger, of course, is if we restrict women's purpose to just that. But I don't get quite the same sense of this need for script and purpose that you get among young men now. And the way we solve that historically is, well, you're going to be a provider, a husband, and a father. I mean, my parents fell in love when they were 17 and they were married at 21. And they're still married after lots of trials and tribulations in their mid-80s now. But it's quite clear that my dad, to some extent, grew up in that marriage, and that marriage and that role as father tethered him, shaped him, gave him purpose. He knew what he had to do, even when they tragically lost a couple of kids. You still have to get up in the morning and do your thing, right? There was never a question about whether we needed him or whether he was needed. And I do think that these changes we've had have left a lot of men struggling for that, especially with much later marriage, as you say. Having talked to your son, away from perhaps in a marriage at 18 to one at 30. But the question is, well, what do the guys do in their 20s? Because in the past, they would be getting that through marriage and the breadwinner role. It's very interesting in the US. I don't know what's happening here. I'm not Roman Catholic, actually. I'm actually Eastern Orthodox by conversion. But I was at a Roman Catholic church here in Denver where I was visiting yesterday, and it was full of young men. And it confirmed what the data were telling us, which is a bit of a turn back to religion among young men. And when you talk to them about it, which I do, what you often find is that they are hungry for structure, purpose, and meaning. And if family life isn't providing that, and maybe the workplace isn't providing that to young men, they are hungry for it. And some of them are turning to religion. They could turn something else. But I think what that tells me is not that that's the solution necessarily. It is more that the hunger is real, and that these men are desperately searching for a positive message about why we need them and why we value them and why we love them and how precious they are in our sight as a society, that they are not toxic, they are precious, not despite being men, but because they're men. And then lastly, they're desperate for a sense of like, okay, what's my script? What's my purpose? I need to be attached to something bigger than myself in order to flourish. That is very important for men, and we're not finding enough ways to do that for them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I actually saw someone speaking to this point where, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but, women, she was talking about how women, we are born intrinsically with pain within us, okay? Like, we're going to have a period, we're going to grow a baby, we're going to birth a baby. So we are intrinsically built with this growth mechanism. Men don't have that. So they have to go out in the world and they have to find their pain to grow through it. And I feel like unfortunately, there's this growing perception that, like, I think they're too afraid to make a mistake, like, well, shit, then I'm going to be called toxic, or I'm going to get it wrong. Or, I think I see so many men kind of cowering under a rock instead of, they're so used to being told their purpose is for someone else. And it's actually the exact same as women. We've been constantly told that we're here for someone, to serve someone else, that if they even look at themselves or their own journey or their own purpose, then they're being toxic or they're being selfish, or, women are judging them from across the table, whatever it is. And I feel, for me, this is where and equality is a really big part of my energy. Like, honestly, ever since I was tiny, I'm like, I just want everyone to get along. Like, honestly, I just want everyone to get along. And I think one of the greatest challenges is that we label it. And gender is an obvious label. Do you know what I mean? Like, there is definitely difference and separation, but I think we're focusing way too much on the difference and the separation than the solutions to how do we actually help men and women. And I think there's a lot being invested into women. But how do we help young men, especially, not be afraid? I think of the Indigenous people. So the Indigenous Australians at 13, the men go out on walkabout. So they go out, they find themselves. There's all these rites of passage. And I feel like our men don't have those rites of passage anymore. And I think that's impacting them. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think that mature masculinity is more socially constructed than mature femininity, precisely for the reason I love that line that pain is within women and you grow through pain. We have to construct those growth opportunities for boys and men through things like rites of passage, etc. And I think there's, in a weird way, I think there is a hunger for that pain among men, pain that you grow through. I hadn't thought of it that way before, and a lot of those rites of passage involve some discomfort or pain, struggle. Right? They don't work otherwise, and certainly uncertainty and change and all of that. I completely agree with that. There's this lovely line from the Hopi Indians in the US, where it's like the mums are really good at keeping the kids by the fire, and the dads are really good at taking them up the mountain and showing them the world that they have to conquer on the other side. And I really like that because it does capture, I think, that some of this complementarity between the two. And weirdly, I think that the lack of rites of passage, the lack of just finding ways to infuse young men with purpose and connection and meaning, and saying, we need you. I think to some extent, there's always a contest for the allegiance of young men in every, and what you do is you thoughtfully win that contest through rites of passage, through rituals and so on. So, but like, young men are in search of something to ally themselves to. They just are. And so the question is, who wins that contest? And if we don't win it, someone else will, or they'll just, we'll lose them all together. But I agree with you also. I thought this is a very hard question for me, but this question about, are we overemphasizing gender? Now, I run the American Institute for Boys and Men. I'm chair of the UK Institute for Centre Research on Policy on Boys and Men, and yet I agree with you. I think actually, if we were just more straightforwardly addressing these issues, there would be less discussion of masculinity and gender identity. But I'll go one step further and say that I think that it seems pretty clear to me that the way to get someone to really think about an identity and maybe lean hard into it and struggle with it is to threaten it, is to pathologize it. Like, one of my Jewish friends says, nothing makes him more Jewish than anti-Semitism. Right? The more anti-Semitism is, the more Jewish he gets. And I think you could apply that to anything, racism, right? I think one of the reasons why there's such a strong black identity in the US is precisely because of anti-black racism, right? But I think something a bit similar is happening now around masculinity in men, which is that by pathologizing it, by saying it's toxic, by talking about the patriarchy all the time, we've actually, I think, created a situation where it's become more of an identity marker for men than it needs to be. Rather than just saying, hey, you guys need some help, we're here for you. We've made it more of a cultural issue than it needs to be. And I'd love it to become more of just an everyday issue that we all care about.
I love that. And look, I think that one of the most important things, and of course I do because this is my work, is like really helping individuals, create their own sovereignty, their own power, their own identity. And I feel like one of the challenges, and I know this has been a challenge in my life, as I said, I'm Gen X, so I was right at the edge of things. Like, I also think that we're the best freaking, like, we can get anything done. We're amazing. It's an awesome, time to be born. But yes. I think one of the big challenges I know in my life is that I was always like reaching for a mentor, a role model, someone who'd been there first. And in so many cases that didn't exist. And I think about, boys and men right now, especially the current state of, US politics, like, where are the great men, And it's not to say that there aren't, but there's so much focus on the ones that aren't great. And I feel like that's how the brain works. We need to see that something's possible. The brain needs the evidence that something's possible. And we have all these boys and men kind of running around going, well, shit, I don't know who to be. And I can't actually see a role model out there that feels like that fits for me. So how do we, the way I solve that problem in my work is I'm like, well, shit, I'm going to empower you. I'm going to help you. You're going to map that out for yourself. That role model, that mentor is probably going to be a bunch of different people all kind of stuck together. But like, from your perspective, like, how do we help our boys, especially, like, where are the role models? Where are the mentors that they can model themselves on? And how do we solve that problem? Are you looking to build a successful human design or astrology business? Do you wish that you had your own chart tool on your website so you don't have to send people somewhere else to get it? Bodygraph.com provides all the resources you need to turn this vision into a reality. We use this incredible software in our business to provide charts and custom reading reports at the click of a button, generate leads, and bring in lots of passive revenue. Bodygraph.com has already helped coaches and entrepreneurs generate over $2.5 million in revenue. If you're ready to take your business seriously, start with a free trial and use the code Human Design Podcast to get 30% off for 6 months. Here's what you can do with Bodygraph.com. Embed stunning charts directly into your website, build personalized lead magnets to grow your email list, create and sell detailed reading reports, and even use their free website builder to get started fast. Bodygraph.com is the ultimate all-in-one platform for building your human design or astrology business. If you're ready to join the community of successful entrepreneurs, visit bodygraph.com and start building your dream business today. Follow the link in the show notes and use the code Human Design Podcast to get 30% off for 6 months.
Yeah, well, they need to be in real life, I think, rather than online. I think that's how you win. I think the search, I mean, if you look at some of the more reactionary online figures that young men are flocking to, the most enthusiastic men are typically the ones who didn't have a good relationship with a father. Maybe they don't even have a father in their lives, or other male role models. It doesn't have to be fathers. And so I think that hunger is also one for, how should I be? There's one of my favorite lines from the women's movement is, you can't be it if you can't see it. Mm-hmm. And I think that applies very strongly in this case, which is like, I can't be that kind of man if I can't see that kind of man in my own life. It's why I'm kind of obsessed with male representation in certain fields like teaching. But I will tell you, I'll be very personal about this. I'll tell you where the great men are. There is one place where they are, which is a 5th grade classroom in Baltimore City, Maryland, where my son is a teacher. And that 6'4", athletic, beautiful lump of masculinity in front of those kids every day, coaching their soccer team afterwards. He does arm wrestles with them. If they beat him at an arm wrestle, they get out of homework for that day. But he says so far none of them have beaten him. But they're 11, Emma, and so I'm sure he's breaking some kind of rule. But like, when I think about like positive, like just good, great men in kids' lives, I think about my son teaching 5th grade. And what we need is that 1,000 times over, and in the community, and through church groups, scout groups, community groups, etc., neighbors. Like, there's this phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, which I love, but some of the villagers have to be men. Yeah. If you want the village to raise the boys well, especially, but also not just the boys. Actually, it turns out that girls do much better in life if they've had a good relationship with some male role models, especially their father as well, because they get a better sense of what men are like, what good men are like. And so it's especially important for boys, of course. But I think, well, we can't beat these guys online, but we can beat them in the classroom. We can beat them in the neighborhood. We can beat them in the community. And right now, there isn't enough of a call to men to say, we need you to be in the lives of these boys in your community.
I love that. And look, where I live, I'm very lucky. I live in a place in Australia called Byron Bay. So we're very, very progressive. We're all over it. I'm actually looking at a lot of my friends that, they're in their early 30s. They're having babies. They're nearly none of them are married. And I look at their partners, and there's one of my friends who she tells this story about when the two of them met and they hit it off straight away. And he said to her, look, honestly, I'm going through something right now. I can't be with you right now. I really want to, but I can't. Can we just be friends? Can we press pause? And I remember her telling me this story, and meanwhile, they're expecting their second child now. That she then, like 6 months or 12 months later, he said, okay, the truth is my dad had cancer. There was all this stuff going on, and I really wanted to show up for you in the relationship. And I look at these young men and think, fuck, like you're epic. Like that's epic to have the bravery to say that. And to also have the woman that went, because, you know, she says like, God, I was like, really? You're lying to me. This isn't true. Okay, I'm just going to stick around. And so for me, I'm in this position where I see this great potential that it is happening, but there is a level that it has to happen faster. You know, we have to, you know, I don't know, like somehow, and I suppose it's conversations like this that really help us, because for me, there's this piece like I don't even want to talk about toxic masculinity because I don't want to even put my focus on that. You know, I think about my young boys, and these are great men. Like my 15-year-old, he came back from camping. My 18-year-old when he was 15 came back from a camping night, and he was saying, "Yeah, Mum, we sat around the campfire and we talked about why we need external validation from social media, and one of the guys was feeling pressured by his dad to perform, and I'm like, dude, you're going to be all right. This is all going to be okay for you because you guys can talk about it." But it's like, how do we actually get more and more of this out into the public arena? Because boys need to know that they can actually have conversations, that they can relate. And this kind of leads me in, sorry, I'm kind of yabbering, but this leads me into the mental health topic. So for me personally, at 28, I was diagnosed with depression and panic disorder. I was told I'd have to live with it for the rest of my life. I was like, well, I'm not going to consider killing myself for the rest of my life. So I'm either going to solve this problem myself or I'm going to end it. And ultimately, that's the work I do today. I solved the problem. I healed it. So I think that boys' mental health is such a massive issue. I'm not sure where I heard it, so maybe I even read it in your book. But I heard that teenage boys, like 13 years, this is my youngest at the moment, they look so tough on the outside, but they're so much more sensitive than girls on the inside. And I'm like, whoa, because that's not the way they're treated. So how should we be focusing on boys' mental health? Because ultimately their mental health is what's leading to this high suicide rate.
Yeah, well, first of all, you're right that Lisa Demure has written on this subject of the greater sensitivity of boys, that actually they're more fragile. And I really want to use my words carefully here because I'm sort of, if I am, let's say there's a 14-year-old boy listening to this who's struggling and he hears me say fragile or sensitive, like I don't want to put him off the conversation. What I want him to do is to sort of make him feel like if you're struggling, you're not alone. And actually figuring out this transition to adulthood is just a bit harder for boys. And if things go wrong, they just seem to affect boys quite a bit more than girls. They just do. That's just fact. We can figure out why. And so that means that we actually have to extend at least as much care and concern to our boys as to our girls. And right now, I think that because of some of the work around social media, et cetera, there's been a bit of a tendency to neglect the just as pressing problems of boys. Then the question is how? And it is through those sorts of conversations that it sounds like your son had. And it's very interesting to me that it was around a campfire because actually boys and men typically do better when they're shoulder to shoulder and engaged in some kind of other activity rather than face to face. And so actually it turns out that coaches are mental health professionals in disguise. So are camp leaders, scout leaders, etc. And so just creating spaces that are male friendly. In other words, like, you know, about the men's sheds movement and so on, which is like men doing stuff together. It's like, for reasons that we could either argue about forever or just accept, men seem to do a little bit better at sharing with each other when they're engaged in some other activity, right? So we have to structure it a little bit more and not call it mental health. It's interesting, this health company in the US did some work with young men, and the young men reported that the very term mental health is seen by them as female. They said, that's the thing that all the girls talk about all the time. That's the thing girls struggle with. So mental health is now coding as female, because almost all our mental health professionals are women. We talk about it in a way that tends to be a bit more female friendly. Most of the images that you'll see associated with mental health are of women or of young women, etc. And so actually the men don't even see themselves in the conversation about mental health. And I'd love that to change. But in the meantime, actually mental health isn't just done in mental health settings. It's done in community settings, families, etc. And so I'll say one more thing about this negativity point, which is we also just have to create a space where we're just not telling them what's wrong with them all the time. President Barack Obama went on his own wife's podcast a week ago, and he said, we just keep talking about what's wrong with boys. We need to talk about what's right with boys. And so I do think atmospherically we've created quite a difficult culture for boys to feel like they're flourishing in, because more people now know the term toxic masculinity than know the word masculinity in young people's circles. And we just haven't created a culture, I think, where they're hearing and feeling how valued they are. And that's the background noise, I think, to this more proximate question of how do we get the help to them.
Yeah. And, again, I'm back in this place of it's freaking not a gender thing, like at the end of the day, kids should feel safe. Like I have this whole thing about failure. Like there is no such thing as failure. I'm either winning or learning. And I feel like this is such an important place for kids. Like I've watched my boys grow up and, my eldest, and I'm grateful that I've seen my eldest go through this process, because now know I'm like, dude, you're going to be all right. And I think one of the big things that I'm constantly telling my boys is like, you don't need to be perfect and you're going to work it out. Like you have totally got this, even though it doesn't feel like it right now. You have got this. And, I really watched my eldest kind of step up when his dad and I separated, because again, he was given this purpose, and all of a sudden his brother and him got along so much better because his brother would, they had these deep conversations about what was going on and how they felt and the challenges. And I think that this gender piece is, as a mother, and as a mother who honestly has done most of the raising of my boys, like I'm the one that had the conversations around sex and intimacy, and still to this day, like they will come to me for those sort of things. I think we need to be really careful saying that, oh, look, only one gender can help them. It's like only one gender can help women. Like that's not true. That's just not true. And I feel like boys need to feel safe to make mistakes. So do girls. They need to feel safe to experiment and to grow. And, I know my youngest went through he made a really crappy choice at school, and he went through this, really like, oh shit, I'm a bad person. And gratefully the school that he's at, they were like, people just make shitty choices. And I think it really formed him, because he wasn't pointed and, told he was wrong and bad and all of these things. He was very much focused on, you just made a shitty choice in reaction because you were hurt. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges these days, and why bullying is such a big thing, is because men and boys have not had that freedom to express themselves. And because maybe we haven't understood. It's funny you talk about that, or it's interesting you talk about that research about being side by side and engaged in activities with boys. So I always have the big conversation, especially with my youngest, when we're driving somewhere. So he's not
classic
exactly right. So he's not looking
not face
at me.
to face.
He's over there.
Yes.
The other thing I stopped doing was when I was trying to have, and I remember I was having like a sex and drug conversation with my youngest, and he was on his phone. And I remember thinking, I'm just going to experiment. I'm just going to let him. And he wasn't really, like, because I was looking at his phone, there's really nothing going on his phone. Like he wasn't scrolling. And I'm like, I'm just going to let you be on your phone. And I remember thinking, wow, that conversation went so much better. And because I wasn't pressuring him to perform the way I thought he should. And instead I kind of let him be what was naturally, intrinsically aligned for him, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's just the climate, the atmosphere. Like, don't be inadvertently thinking that they're going to code sort of female male. And I agree with you again about the gender point, not making that the salient thing. But here's what I would say. I think we need to understand the gender differences enough to not inadvertently trip up and make something like less easy for a girl or less easy for a boy. Right. That's all. That's it. Right. Then you don't. Then it isn't like, oh, this is how I'm going to do it. This is how you parent boys, right? And this is how mums parent boys, and how dads parent boys, and how dads parent girls. Like, it's not. That's not true by and large, right? But I do think that just accidentally we can end up. Well, we can do something which is close to, this is more of a men's rights line, but they do sometimes say that, like, we have a tendency sometimes to say, like, if a girl's struggling or a young woman's struggling, we try and, it's because of something's happening to his social media, or it's the patriarchy and so on. And if a boy's struggling kind of mental health, we have a kind of bit of a tendency sometimes to say, what's wrong with you? And try and fix you. And so there's a little bit of truth to that, I think, which is there's a bit of a tendency sometimes to kind of inadvertently just load a bit too much on kind of boys and men. We individualize their problems if we're not careful, rather than assuming that there's something about the system or the structure. And so I'm not saying anyone does that deliberately, but I think we, as parents, we do it accidentally. My wife had this thing where the kids would come home from school to our two youngest when they were going through this stage, and she would stare at them over the breakfast bar, and she'd be like, "How was your day? What did you learn?" And then she'd be giving them, "Have some protein," and they would be like, "I don't know, whatever." No, nothing, like some mono. And then later on, I'd be video gaming with them, or she would be driving somewhere with them. It didn't have to be with me, whatever, shoulder to shoulder. And they would say, this weird thing happened today. This girl said this thing at school, or this teacher, and you're like, oh, interesting. As soon as you took that pressure off them, like face to face, and just turns out that is a bit more difficult for boys on average, not only for boys. And so we just have to be careful. This is where I do think that different parents and male teachers and female teachers can be really complementary, is because it just means that we have a mixture of styles which are going to work differently for different kids. Like, there might be some things where, your ex will actually have a better style around certain things than you, right? For one of your sons, but not for the other.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. I'm reading another book at the moment, like, just to that point, and I remember actually noticing this with my ex. So it was a habit that I created early. And it's like, when men come home from school, work, whatever, they need time to decompress. Like, they can't just jump into a conversation where women are like, I just want to tell you everything. And I think that's really interesting in my family, because I know that my kids will share their day over the dinner table. So I don't even bother to try to engage them anymore. God, I did try. Don't get me wrong. I tried.
Of course, every mother does.
Yeah. Exactly. But
interrogate them. They come in the door and you start the interrogation begins. Yeah.
What do you mean you don't know? Yeah. But yeah, and just like, I think one of the really big challenges that I've noticed as a mother of boys, is that there's this balance between they need space and they need attention. There's this real balance of like, well, when do you need me to be here, and when do you need me to leave you alone? And I think that that's something that's not as prevalent in women. I mean, I'm an introvert, so I had that as a kid, but I was like, whatever you need, I can be the version of me you need me to be, parents, and then I'll just go and be. Whereas I think with boys, there's this balance that they're kind of not aware of, that sometimes they need you and sometimes they need you to leave them alone. And I think that's something that I definitely noticed with my two. Like, working that out has been a game changer for me, because ultimately, otherwise I try to help them solve a problem that they will solve on their own. And it's so much better if they do solve it on their own, but they also need to know that there's someone there to help them,
Yeah, that's really interesting. And also the additional complexity is that just psychologically, in order to grow up, we have to pull away, especially from mum, right? Because we were part of mum for a while, and then, mum was our main carer probably the early years. And then as you get into adolescence, that whole point of detachment, like, in order to then become, let's use your term around sovereignty, right? Part of that is about that separation. And that's why the teenage years are so difficult for everybody, because that's when that separation is taking place. And so, and of course, but it doesn't happen overnight. And so you're going through these years where it's kind of, 1 minute they feel like a 3-year-old again who just needs a cuddle, right?
I love those moments,
right? And then all of a sudden they're like a they don't want anything to do with you, right? They're 30. And so what's happening is that just in this period, but I do think it's particularly difficult for maybe for boys and mothers in some ways, because that pulling away is absolutely necessary. The creation of the distance between them and you is so psychologically important for them, but at the same time very painful, both for them and I think for you. And so I think dads and other men can really help with that. Those rites of passage you talked about earlier, they were forms of separation as well. It was men taking young men to go and do something away from mum, and the away from mumness of it was kind of important. And I think that's just really hard.
It's such an interesting dynamic, like I remember getting some advice when my kids were babies, and just being aware that you are raising these little humans to send them out into the world, so don't get attached like any more than you have to. And there's this great reel going around at the moment of this letter that a mum wrote to her son, and it's basically all about, look, I grew one of my favorite humans in me, and then I raise him to leave me. And I think that this is something that as women we need to be responsible for. I know I've always been focused on raising men, not just tall boys, and because I haven't had a lot of really strong great male role models. I loved my dad, don't get me wrong, but he certainly wasn't, he didn't set me up for success. Let me just put it that way.
Okay.
And I think that that's one of the things as women that we need to really be responsible for, that we are not encouraging our boys to stay attached, that we are actually, I know my eldest, he and I are very close. We've got a great friendship. And one thing that I've always talked about is, like, whether you like it or not, I'm sending you on a plane. Like, as soon as you finish school, you're gone. Go and find, go and discover the world. Go discover yourself. So I think we can have that balance of like having the connectedness as their moms, but it is also our responsibility to encourage them out into the world as best we can, because it's not serving them, and it's certainly not serving the rest of the planet for us to try and, keep our babies forever, even though we'd love to.
Yes, that's right. And that's part, again, and again, with at the risk of overemphasizing some of the differences, but I think at this point it's clear that most of these things are the same, is that actually that back to that Hopi Indian thing, like the dads take them up the mountain. I think that it's actually a better example. Like Jonathan Haidt, whose work you might know, he wrote a book called The Anxious Generation, which is all about phones in schools and social media. He's done this thing recently where he's pointed out that if there's a parent pretending to be a predator of their children, this is when they're young, chasing them around the living room, saying, I'm going to eat you up. I'm a Tyrannosaurus Rex. I'm going to gobble you up. So, which parent is that? It's almost always dad. And he says it just turns out that just actually the conditioning of mothers makes it harder for them to even pretend to be a predator of their own children. It's just difficult. It's also quite difficult for women to throw their kids up in the air and hope they catch them or have them jump off a wall. Like just what mums just don't. Whereas as dads, we love that, and it turns out we get an oxytocin spike from doing that. It spikes our love hormone and theirs. So fathers bond with their kids by throwing them in the air.
Oh my God. And I used to remember my ex, he used to do that all the time. And I'm like, I'm in the background going, I know this is good for them, but it was so uncomfortable for me. I was like, I can't be a part of this, but I know it's good. I trust my gut, but I can't
Good
be
for
a part
you.
of it.
Good for you. But by the way, that's the healthy creative tension there, isn't it? It was where you recognized it. It was important. You wouldn't do it. Part of you had palpitations about it. There's this great, you've probably seen it, there's a meme, and it's like, it's a picture of a kid being thrown in the air by a dad. And it's like how far it looks to the dad, how far it looks to the kid, how far it looks to mom.
Yeah, it's so
but
true.
The point of that is just that actually, we can all do it, and we should all take responsibility for it. I don't want to say that like mums can't do this, dads can only. I'm not trying to be essentialist about it, but I am convinced by the evidence that dads are a bit better maybe at having that creative tension about pushing them out in the world, take some risks, build some resilience, get some stuff wrong, fall on your face, hurt yourself emotionally and physically, get back up. I just think it's not. of course mums can do that. I'm sure you're doing it, but I do think it's a bit harder for mums to do it. I just think it is, and that's where the yin and yang maybe of some of what we bring to the parenting project actually is kind of a beautiful difference rather than it doesn't trap us. It doesn't mean we can only do this. It just means that maybe you've got a bit of a special gift for that.
Yeah. And again, it just, like, honestly, I am the mum that's ridden the skateboard, surfed the surf, have done all the scary things with them. In fact, I was always the one that was like, let's go do something scary. And the three boys would be like, ah.
Yeah.
However, I think that what's so important about what you're saying is that this is why, honestly, like, I'm 50 and I'm like ready to start looking for a new partner. And I'm like, well, where are the men? And I think that there's so much of, because, you know, either women have taken over parenting, or men have felt lost and disconnected from their purpose, or all these other things going on. Like, I think this is why it's so important when we're raising boys, that even though, like me, I do have a tendency to be the one that's like doing the extreme sports, there was always part of me that's like, yeah, but, you know, they're going to grow up and be a man. So there is very much part of me that has to allow that to happen, and, you know, that to be a focal point. So, yeah, I don't want to get overly attached to the gender roles. Like, women can only do this and men can only do that.
Right.
But, you know, what we see is who we become. So I think it's that really important, you know, men need to have the freedom to be men without feeling like they're going to offend someone all the time.
Exactly, yeah, and again, at its worst, that can become this. We can drift back into these essentialist roles, right? This is how a man has to be, or whatever, and they're all very different. I mean, I have 3 sons, and they're incredibly different. And so the idea that, like, these are the kinds of men that I've kind of created. Well, okay, so one of them's, you know, quite quiet and, you know, very, very sensitive, very kind of creative. Another one's kind of much more athletic. Another one's a real tech nerd, you know, whatever, right? And so they're ticking different boxes in different ways, you know. And so I agree that we don't want to. It's a real challenge with my work, honestly. It's like I don't want to become a gender essentialist, but I also don't want to deny some of these differences. And the trouble is, right now, it's almost like you have to choose between the two. It's almost like, I mean, one of the criticisms I get, probably more from the left, is because I do think there are some biological differences here. It's not all socialized. It's like, okay, you're a gender essentialist, you know. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I just think there's a bit of that. But then, of course, you get the other people on the other side that are like, it's all about that. And, you know, women can't be engineers and men can't be nurses because their brains aren't wired for it. And I'm like, are you kidding me? How dare you? My sister-in-law is an engineer. My son's a 5th grade teacher. How dare you? And actually, the one who's a 5th grade teacher is the one who's most kind of overtly masculine in the stereotypical way in his affect, right? He's the athlete. He's the big guy. He's kind of more he codes more traditionally masculine, and is teaching 5th grade. So don't you dare tell me that, like, or that my sister-in-law can't be. But also don't be naive enough to think that we are all completely blank slates. That has not led us to a good place. Like, I think that has neglected both girls and some of this. I think one of the reasons why girls, by the way, are so badly affected by social media is precisely because of some of the ways that they are wired, not hardwired, but a bit more wired to be a bit more relational, which means that the relational bullying and ostracism that can take place online is just, it hits girls harder because of some of the ways that girls are. Like, the mean girls phenomenon is true. Not true of all. It's true. And that's whack. And so unless we understand that aspect of female psychology that is a little bit different, then we don't understand the incredible risk that that particular form of technology is posing to our girls. We could say, as men, we could say, well, just sticks and stones can't break your bones, just ignore it. What's wrong with you, right? That's what I would do as a guy, right? But, like, no, that's the point. They're not guys. And vice versa. If men don't feel needed and they feel like they're and they're much more at risk of taking their own lives, etc., that's partly, don't tell them just to be women. Right? Don't tell them to cry more. Like, just meet them where they are. And I think this is kind of where I'm landing. It's a bit of a ramble, but I think your point about wanting to downweight gender in the long run will actually be met by meeting people where they are in the here and now as living, breathing men, women, boys and girls in all of their differences, but without ignoring the fact that they are in fact men and women and boys and girls.
Yeah, exactly. And, it just comes back to the whole, I talk a lot about wellness on this podcast as well. And I talk about the lack of research on women. It's the same thing. You can't tell us that all these years, all this medical research has been done predominantly on men. And no wonder it's not working on us, because our biology is different. So yes, it's absolutely viable. And again, because my work is behavioral coaching, I think what's so important is that we don't have this identity of like, I'm a woman first or I'm a man first.
Right.
I am me first and I am this individual first. And part of that identity is the gender piece, So there's things that as a woman I consider, and as my boys are men or young men, they consider, It's just, I find it so, I know we're in this information age and research has given us so much power to move forward. But I think one of the things that just pisses me off is the nature of it being black and white. Like, we're not black and white. We are grey. We are every freaking shade of grey. And I think that's where we need to be playing in the grey and really running the experiments as individuals, going, okay, so what does work for me, what doesn't work for me, what works for my kids, what doesn't work for my kids, and being led, but not, putting it on like, well, this person's an expert, so I should do exactly what they say, even though I'm not getting the results.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no, I think we can really enjoy that variety and diversity without having to say that there's nothing to the fact that you say you're male, female. I mean, I think actually the idea that there's kind of, you mentioned earlier, growing through pain. I actually just think the reproductive roles of women and the reproductive biologies of women, and you've talked about menstruation, childbirth, menopause. It's really striking to me that the American Psychological Association got into huge trouble for putting out some advice on working with boys and men because it was seen as way progressive, and it was. It wasn't good in many ways. But what really struck me about it was that they just said, look, men are socialized to be more driven by sex, or socialized to be more risk-taking, or socialized to be whatever, right? No mention of biology at all. And then alongside that, they had this advice for working women and girls, and they said the impact of menstruation and menopause and childbirth on women's psychology as a result of shifts in hormones is as follows. And so they treated women like flesh and blood, and men like blank slates. And I said, okay, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot. And it was a great example, I think, of the problem we've gotten into, where actually understanding women's health, including women's psychology, does require us to recognize that women are flesh and blood, right? That they are minds, but they're also bodies, and that our bodies and minds interact with each other. I'm sure your work has touched on some of that, right? You can't say that, but then say, but men are blank slates. Men's bodies, men's biology doesn't in any way affect their psychology. Never mind the fact that, as you probably noticed with your boys, that the teenage years involve a flood of testosterone.
Oh my goodness. Or like every mother or every parent of boys knows 2, 7, 13 and 15.
Yeah, right.
When the testosterone
testosterone goes
in, you're like, whoa, here it is again.
I know, and it's so interesting to me how some of the people who would be most adamant, very progressive people, adamant about the rights of adults in particular to have to become trans and to go through reassignment, then sort of conveniently ignore the testimony of the trans men who've had testosterone treatments, who say, wow, this is what it's like. I mean, their testimony is extraordinarily powerful and moving, I think, in the effect of these biological changes that have led to these changes in their psychology. And the very same people, very often, who would advocate incredibly strongly for the right, as would I, for the right of those trans men to undertake those biological interventions, which then affect their psychology, are the people who, on the next day, will say, oh, well, no, everything's socialized.
Yeah.
Biology doesn't matter. And I say, well, if biology doesn't matter, why in God's name are you so strongly supportive of those trans interventions then? Doesn't make any sense.
No. And yeah, that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah. But I didn't mean to get us into that.
No,
but from the point of view of testosterone, like, it's like the idea testosterone doesn't matter is crazy.
Yeah. And again, I think unfortunately, the downside of living in the information age is that we can make everything plausible. There's always a piece
Right.
of research that's going to support someone's opinion. And I think one of the things that, my work really centers on is us coming back to ourselves and really feeling into, okay, well, does that feel true for me? Or is it something to move on? And I think, women, especially in my space, we talk so much about intuition, trusting our gut. And I feel like this is something that men, it's time for them to get back to this place where you can trust your gut. You are being guided. And I think men perhaps were, because this part of women was so shamed and even criminalized, and women were killed for it. Like, I actually had my father and my grandfather were both psychic, but they were like, oh,
Oh, wow.
shit, like I can't have, you can't tell anyone that.
Wow.
So I really feel like we're in this place where there's so much that's waking up for men. And I know for my boys, my boys are amazing, extraordinary human beings in their own right. And I just feel like we need, I don't know, the men to start believing in themselves again, not believing in what everyone else tells them is wrong with them.
Right, whether that's from left or right, right?
Exactly.
If they're not careful, they depending on which YouTube channel they flick between. On Monday, they're being told their problem is they're too masculine. On Tuesday, they're being told that they're not masculine enough, and they just want to be themselves.
Yeah.
But they want to be themselves as flesh and blood, men, to the extent that matters. And I really like this point about intuition. It really connects with some of the thinking I'm doing around fatherhood now too, which is like a lot of being people, you learn how to be a parent from your own parents. There's all the books, but so much of it is also intuitive. So much of it is instinctive. And if you as a parent end up doubting your own instincts and intuitions, you're in real trouble. And we have to be careful to include paternal intuition in that as well. Like as dads, we have instincts and intuitions about what's the best or the right thing to do, and they're not always based on anything. I'll give you an example from my own life, which is that one of my kids had relatively mild OCD, like to the extent where he's had to keep his food separate on his plate and was like obsessed with cleanliness and all that kind of stuff. And it really hated like the dishwasher if it had food on, and like just like that. He had that. And so I made his chore cleaning the cat litter tray. And first of all, because I knew that he would really sort it out and make it much cleaner, which he did. He had like a Hoover, he had like a bag, he put gloves on. First of all, you create this amazing system.
I love that you made it a superpower. Like, I think that's so powerful.
He was amazing at it, right? It was much cleaner. But actually, who knows why his OCD went away? But then I talked to some psychologist friends later, and they said actually the only way to deal with OCD is through exposure. They actually just have to do it. They have to do some of that stuff that makes them uncomfortable, and then they'll get over it. And so I could list all my 100 parenting mistakes that I made that same year, but actually I just at some level felt like intuitively at some level he needs to just work through that a little bit, but it has to be a task that he has purpose for, and then that was related to his pocket money and all of that, and his brothers had other tasks, and so I feel like we're all doing a lot of this stuff based on our instincts, and paternal and maternal instincts, parental instincts are just beautiful, wonderful things. And we have to be really careful to make sure that we allow both mothers and fathers to trust their instincts when it comes to their kids, and maybe just to trust our intuitions and our instincts about how to be in the world, and have enough trust that, as you said earlier, very powerfully, is that if we get it wrong, if we make a mistake, or we're clumsy in the execution of some project or conversation or whatever, that people will have enough grace and enough love for us to give us the space to, as you said, like, I'm learning, winning or learning. Yeah. We learn through doing, we learn through screwing a lot of stuff up. And we've really got to make sure that our boys feel that they've got the space to just, grow and make mistakes and fall and get up, and that they're not going to be immediately jumped on and blamed or toxified for doing that. And that's difficult to do. If you don't trust the world around you, it's hard to act on instinct because you're afraid that your instinct will get it wrong in that moment. and then you'll be pilloried for it.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd like to take it one step further, as I think that when you don't trust yourself, that's when you allow the world around you to inform and override your own instincts. And I know
Exactly.
for me,
Then you start looking for somebody else to tell you what to do rather than looking
exactly,
inside yourself. Yes, that's right.
exactly. And I think about, I think about that moment that I sat in the psychologist's chair and he's like, you're going to live with this for the rest of your life. And I was at the lowest point considering taking my own life. But on some level, I'm like, nah. And I said to him, if you can tell me how I got here, I know I can work out how to get out of here. And like, who says that in that point? And I think that this is that we all have this instinct, this intuition. But unless we trust ourselves, unless we believe in ourselves, unless we back ourselves and then create an identity that can fall over and make mistakes and change direction, and then we will let the outside world inform us. And I think that that's a very dangerous thing to be doing at this time in human history. So yeah, and I think going back to the instinct piece, and then I really have to let you go, but this is and I didn't even get to talk about schools and education, but oh well. I think the whole instinct for men, like men are, and the masculine specifically, it is about providing and protecting. So who says that is something that you do with the mind, with the go and educate the mind? Like, yeah, that's great. But there is this level that men need to be able to trust their own instincts. They need to, my 18-year-old, he climbs mountains and he just did his first ice climb. He did it in the snow. And as his mum, I'm like, oh, fuck. Like, I'm like, shit, I'm sitting at home. They have to drive and they're driving 12 hours to get there through the night, like all this stuff that I'm like, dude, that is not a good idea. But of course I'm like, okay, mate. And I think
you say it.
yeah. I think this is the thing that we need to be supporting our boys young, is just to trust themselves, to trust their instincts. And when they get it wrong, to understand that doesn't mean you can't trust yourself. It just means that there was something you had to learn. You had to work this out before you went to the next step or whatever. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges all humans have right now, is just learning to trust themselves, their own path, their own instincts, and that if they go internal first, then the right teachers, mentors, paths, opportunities will open up. But we've got to stop giving our power away to everyone out there.
Yeah, we can't externalize it. I think that's the point here, isn't it? If we externalize those things, then we disempower ourselves, and then we end up beholden to the latest guru or whoever sat on you most recently. And I agree with that. And I think that what ties us together is the sense that we do that in the fullness of who we are. In all our differences, but that includes the extent to which we are differently masculine or feminine, and that's okay. And what's happened, I think, is that because of the understandable fear of the masculine being seen as somehow dominant over, better than, in competition with the feminine, because that is, of course, what our history has been so long, what that's done is it's led to an understandable, but now I think counterproductive suspicion of the masculine, which for boys and men who are actually to different degrees blessed with rather than burdened by their masculinity, has created a difficult environment for them. And so we have all the policy stuff that we all need to do, but at a cultural level, and this is where your conversation has really led this, I think, is at a cultural level, there is just how do we create the space that as humans, we can kind of live fully, including our masculinity and femininity, without those becoming the dominant themes, right? In a way, you have to give space to masculinity and femininity in order for neither of them to become dominant in an odd way. I think the denial of them or the pathologization of either of them, right, to say there's something wrong with femininity and that's why women should wear shoulder pads and deepen their voices and stand in a funny way to have or whatever, or do assertiveness training, whatever the hell it is, that to make them more like pretend to be men, right, rather than just being fucking amazing women. We can't do the same thing to men. We can't say to kind of boys and men that, like, if we could just somehow extract all this masculinity from you, you'd be good. That's a terrible way to treat them. And in a weird way, I think it has ended up empowering the more reactionary channels of that masculinity because we have denied it the more positive channels for it. By denying masculinity positive channels, we have actually ended up directing it into those negative channels. And that is our fault. It is not the fault of the young men, or indeed of the, I mean, I don't like the exploitative reactionary influences, but you know what I mean? That's how markets work. You can supply reacts to demand. And the question is, why is there so much demand for that stuff? And it's because we have failed to get past the zero-sum framing around this. And we have failed to have the kind of conversation it sounds like you're having in your home, Emma. So they're very lucky to have a mum like you, where we can talk about this stuff in a positive and non-judgmental way. So thank you. Thank you for your work. And this was fun.
Yeah, thank you. This was fantastic. And I really trust that those listening got what they needed from today, because I feel like I'm such a big believer that we are all perfectly imperfect, and we just need to come back to that instead of pointing the finger at everybody else.
Correct. But it's not, you can acknowledge human suffering without always finding someone to blame for it, I think is a big part of the point. So,
exactly.
And thank you. It's so early for you. This is why you're having a coughing fit. It's like mid-afternoon for me in Colorado. Early there in Australia, you're having some sort of. I hope you're going to keep all this, Emma. Like, this is the break. This is the breakdown. If you were more masculine, Emma, then you wouldn't be having a coughing fit. You realize it's your feminine side. Is right.
Exactly. It's my weakness, man.
It's your weakness. This is feminine. This is feminine weakness right here. Like I can talk fine. I had a massive nosebleed earlier, by the way. So I managed to get it under control in time for this. So we could have had quite the podcast where it's you coughing and me bleeding, talking about the differences between male and female weaknesses. So.
Yeah, like here's the evidence of perfectly imperfect, right? I'm either winning or learning.
But anyway, it's been great. I really appreciate your time and your work, and I hope that's not a real cough. It's just an early morning cough. But
it's just the back end of a cold. So
I'm sorry. I hope you feel better. All right. Well, it's great to meet you. Thanks.
You too, and thank you so much. It's been fantastic. No.